Ephesians 1, verse 7. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the, and your text is either going to say the riches of his grace or the abundance of God's grace. Really interesting passage. In Ephesians 1, Paul wrote one of the most thorough theological statements about God. And one of the biggest things that he focused on as he was writing this big, long sentence was the characteristic of God's grace. And here's what he says. When you have become a believer and have a relationship with Jesus, you are a recipient of an abundance of God's grace. Not just a little bit of grace, not just a few pieces of grace, but a multitude, an abundance of grace is how the Apostle Paul describes it. So much so that he modifies this word grace with riches of God's grace. Most New Testament scholars will tell you that the word that Paul uses for riches there takes us back to an Old Testament word. In the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament, this is the same word that is used to describe the most wealthy king of Israel who ever lived on the planet. This is the wealthy King Solomon, who in chapter 10 of 1 Kings, verse 23, it says King Solomon was wiser and wealthier than any of the kings on the earth at that time. When Paul described the abundance of grace that God lavishes on believers, the first image that came into his mind could have been the wealth of Solomon. And that's how he was filtering and thinking through the grace of God that's given to believers through Jesus Christ. Last week, we started to look at the incredible theology that's packed in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. And we saw one thing more than anything else. We saw that God has a plan that changes absolutely everything. It's a plan that changes our worldview. It's a plan that helps us think about the world differently, to think about what we're doing in the world and what God has called us here for. We saw that God's plan changes things. It changes our perspective, it changes our priorities, and it changes our purpose for living and why we are doing what we're doing. Literally every aspect of our lives are caught up and changed by the plan of God that he has for redemptive history, for his creation. Today, we're going to look a little bit deeper into Ephesians chapter 1, and we're going to focus primarily on God's grace. Believers don't just receive some grace, we receive an abundance of God's grace. And Paul says that God's grace has been lavished on us in Christ. This grace changes at least three things about us. It changes our identity, our authority, and our destiny. And we're going to ask these questions. When we think about the grace of God and how it impacts our identity, we're going to ask this question: who are we in Christ? Number two, authority. Whose are we? Who do we belong to? What authority do we answer to? And what authority do we submit to? And number three, our destiny. Where are we going? I shared this quote with you before. It's worth repeating, from Jerry Bridges. He says this about God's grace: our best days are never so good that they are beyond the need for God's grace, but our worst days are never so bad that they are beyond the reach of God's grace. Here's what Jerry Bridges says: no matter how good of a person you are, you still need the grace of God in your life desperately. No matter how bad of a person you are not beyond the reach of God's grace. God's grace can still bring you out of whatever you have in your life that is just a sinful tendency, something that's an obstacle for you that's wreaking havoc on your life. God's grace is deeper than sin. And so Romans says this: where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. You will never out-sin the grace of God. His grace is too rich, it's too deep for that. It is more powerful, and it will overcome the sin that you have in your lives.